content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, sensitive topics, and explicit language that may be triggering, offensive, or sensitive subjects to some viewers and listeners. Discretion is advised. The purpose of this podcast is to explore and discuss true crime cases for entertainment and educational purposes only. This podcast does not intend to glorify or sensationalize crime, but rather aims to analyze and understand the complexities of human behavior in the criminal justice system. We encourage listeners to approach this content with empathy, critical thinking, respect for the victims and their families.
Tonight, we're peeling back that thin blue line to expose the chilling story of law enforcement gone rogue. In this episode, we'll delve in the shadowy partnership between organized crime and dirty cops, an alliance where loyalty to the mob came before justice. Now, we'll discuss some of those key players, their shocking schemes, and how their actions tarnish the integrity of the very institution meant to uphold the law. Now, I have very special guest Michael Cannell. He is author of Blood and the Badge, The Mafia, Two Killer Cops, and a Scandal That Shocked the Nation. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a good glass of Merlot, because where in this tale, snitches get more than just stitches. It's time to start the show. Let's hit it. Hi, welcome to another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. I am your host, Winnie Schrader. Now, I am no stranger to a good mob movie. You know, from George Raft and Cagney to Al Pacino, Joe Pesci, and De Niro. And I can't forget my all-time fave, The Sopranos. I literally have a painting of Tony staring at me right now. But, you know, depending on whatever you call them, if they're a syndicate, mob, the family, wise guys, or the mafia, we all know what that entails. But what happens when those sacred walls of a made man erase the boundary of that thin blue line? So let me ask you, what happens when the people we trust uphold the law decide to break it instead? Now, tonight we're talking about dirty cops, cops who didn't bend the rules, but they just basically just shattered them. And teaming up with a mafia and a scandal so outrageous, it literally feels like it's straight out of a Hollywood script. For the first time in 40 years, former New York Times editor Michael Cannell unearths the full story behind two ruthless New York cops who acted as double agents for the Mafia. In his new book, Blood and the Badge, The Mafia, Two Killer Cops, and a Scandal That Shocked the Nation. Cannell pulls back the veil to reveal law enforcement's most lurid chapter, an entwined tale of decorated detectives on the Mafia payroll, a true account of police depravity unearthed with intensive reporting. And that was from Joe Pistone, the New York Times bestselling author of Donnie Brasco, My Undercover Life in the Mafia. Now, you can find today's Buy the Book link below in today's description. And please rate and review these books. It helps these authors get their books seen by more people and like-minded who love true crime. So, Michael, welcome to the show.
Hey, Winnie,
Hi,
thanks for
Michael.
having me.
Okay, so, this book, The Blood and the Badge, what made you want to look into this particular case? Now, what kind of time era is this? This is the Mafia in New York. You have cops kind of erasing that thin blue line. So what kind of time period are we talking about when it came to this specific case?
Yeah, good question. The heart of this story lies in the late 80s, but mostly in the early 90s.
Okay.
In the evolution of the mob, that was a very important time period because Rudy Giuliani and other prosecutors were using the RICO laws to bust the mob. You know, organized crime really became organized in the 1930s around Prohibition. And for all of those years, the interceding years, the police were able to pick off the little guys. They were able to arrest and prosecute the street soldiers, but they could never get the big guys. They could never get the bosses. But in this period, the RICO laws, which were written in order to get the bosses, um, had started Giuliani and others started to bust the mob, and so there was a kind of panic and desperation in the mob, because what was happening was that the mobsters were flipping. They were becoming they were cooperating with the federal government and testifying against their friends. So for the mob, it was a period of paranoia and mayhem.
Yeah. Now the two police officers that are featured in your story is Louis, is it Eppolito, and is it Stephen or Stefan? I'm not sure, but it's Kara, is it Kara Kappa? I don't know. I'm horrible with names.
It's Stephen Caracappa. Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa were two highly decorated New York City detectives who were secretly on the Mafia payroll.
Wow. So now, were they originally set up to be kind of a inside person, was this kind of like a Donnie Brasco situation where they just started loving the life of a mobster? Is that basically what happened? They got sucked in?
Just when they thought I was out, they pull me back in.
Yeah, sort of. Louis Eppolito was born into a mafia family. He was the son of a Gambino captain or capo known as Fat the Gangster. And his uncle was a capo known as Jimmy the Clam, right? These are like comically typical,
Oh my God.
typically like straight out of The Sopranos, right?
or Dick Tracy.
Yeah, or Dick Tracy. So Louis Eppolito was born into this family, and his father was kind of an abusive character. No surprise. And so when his father died of a heart attack, Louis Eppolito rebelled against his father. Weeks after his father died, Louis Eppolito joined the police department, and his family couldn't believe it. This, to join the police department was an act of betrayal. And he went on to become a detective, but his family, I mean, in some ways, I think we all try to escape our families, right? Tried to escape his family, but they reeled him back in, and he was a dirty cop. He was a corrupt cop, but he eventually he and his friend and partner Stephen Caracappa eventually went on the payroll of the Lucchese crime family. They were paid $4,000 a month to feed the mafia sensitive information. Who was under surveillance, who was about to be arrested, whose phones were tapped, but most importantly, who was a rat, who was secretly cooperating with the government. And then once the mafia knew who the rats were, who the informants were, then they hired Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa to facilitate their murders, to facilitate their assassinations. So they were bad guys, and they ended up being involved in more than a dozen murders.
Wow. That's scary to know that somebody holding the position to protect and serve is like living this double life. Now, were they just police officers, or were they like detectives, so they didn't really, walk the beat every day and things like that? Kind of what was their life inside the police station first, and then maybe we'll talk about how their life was on the other side with the Mafia and see how that duality and how they handled that, because that doesn't seem like it would be an easy thing to do, especially being a person in the Mafia and police officer or detective. I mean, that's kind of, you're treading some thin waters there. So what was it like for them within the police department during this time?
Well, they were both started out as street cops, but they became detectives and really high-ranking detectives. And Stephen
Okay.
Caracappa, in particular, worked for a unit called the Major Case Squad in New York City. And the Major Case Squad handled the most important cases of all. And what's more, within the Major Case Squad, he was a kind of critical person who collected all of the information and prepared
Mm-hmm.
reports that went up to the higher ups. So every bit of information crossed his desk, and he knew not only what New York City detectives were doing, but what the FBI was doing. And so he was really uniquely positioned to know who the informants were, who in the, say, in the Gambino crime family was secretly cooperating with the police. Stephen Caracappa would know because he saw all of the files and all of the paperworks. And so
Wow.
he and Louis Ippolito simply passed that information along to their secret patrons in the mafia, and that's how this little operation worked.
Wow. Yeah. Because when you look at it on paper, I mean, it's like, it's always kind of like those comical movies, or like, let's say Mrs. Doubtfire. One minute he has to be his character, then he has to be Mrs. Doubtfire, and just kind of bouncing between the two. Now, at any point, did they get close to kind of revealing their hand on the police side before everything fell apart? But like, were people starting to pick up on some of their activity outside the police force?
Oh, for sure. Louis Ippolito, um, well, let me put it this way. One day, the FBI and the New Jersey police raided the home of a Sicilian drug smuggler named Rosario Gambino.
Okay.
And he was a member of the Gambino crime family. And when they raided his home, they found that Rosario Gambino had a copy of his own police file.
Oh,
And so who gave that to him? Well, they found Louis Ippolito's fingerprints on the file. So Louis Ippolito went before Internal Affairs. There was a lot of damning evidence. The case
really?
was dismissed. And so Louis Ippolito, that's one example in which people had real suspicions about him, but he got off.
Wow.
Years later, he and Stephen Caracappa should have been prosecuted by the feds, but for complicated reasons, kind of on a technicality, the feds dropped the case. So once again, it
Yeah.
appeared that they would
Yeah. Because,
skate, as the
yeah, it's like,
mafia
why
said.
is he? Oh gosh, it's so frustrating because it's like, oh, they almost had him and then they just let him go. And um,
Yeah.
now, so they were trying to, constantly cover their tracks. Um, now, when on the side of being in the mafia, what were some of their activities that they were doing that would obviously not be informative? Like, they're breaking the law. They're doing what they're not supposed to do, like murder, things like that. So what was kind of their role other than just feeding them information?
Well, there was their boss in the mafia, their patron in the mafia was a guy, an underboss of the Lucchese crime family called Gaspipe Queso. And Gaspipe Queso had been attacked while he was eating an ice cream cone outside of a strip mall in the Mill Basin neighborhood of Brooklyn. And he got away. He ran into a restaurant and hid in the basement But then he devoted himself to figuring out who had plotted his assassination. And so he hired Ippolito and Caracappa to help him with that. And one thing he hired them to do was to abduct a young man named Jimmy Heidel, who was the one who was in sort of who was in charge of this assassination attempt and the one who really botched it. So they went to Jimmy Heidel's house and looked for him there. They eventually picked him up in Brooklyn, and because they had a police car and because they had police badges, because they were detectives, it was relatively easy for them to pick people up and say, you're coming down to the precinct house with us. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Jimmy Heidel, except instead of going to the precinct house, they went to a garage and they tied Jimmy Heidel up and they put him in the back of a car and they drove him to the parking lot of a Toys R Us way out along the Belt Parkway in a remote part of Brooklyn. And they delivered Jimmy Heidel to their patron, Gaspipe Casso. Gaspipe Casso took Jimmy Heidel to a friend's basement where and there really isn't any other word to use except tortured him. He shot him, by his own admission. Casso shot him more than 15 times. And he was really torturing him because he was trying to get information out of Jimmy Heidel, which worked. Yeah. And then Jimmy Heidel said, I'm going to ask you one thing, and that is when you kill me, dump my body on the street so that my mother can get the life insurance. And Casso didn't do that. That body was never found. But that's an example, to answer your question, that's an example of the kind of errands that Ippolito and Caracappa were doing for the mob. And they could do it partially because they were policemen.
Yeah, they had that badge. So it just kind of gave them a free pass to just kind of do whatever the heck they want and just say, hey, I got a badge. But yeah, because like looking at it, I can't understand how do I want to put this? How the mob, like, they must have had full trust that now in these guys to not, because there's always that fear, especially in the mob double crosser. You always hear about that. Was there anything that they did that made the mafia kind of like keep an eye on them too? Were they kind of doing things like that where they were kind of paranoid as well?
Everybody was paranoid. And for that reason, it's a little more complicated than I've let on. For that reason, the way it worked was that they operated through an intermediary. A drug dealer named Bert Kaplan was the intermediary between the detectives and the mob. And Bert Kaplan kept everything compartmentalized so that the mob didn't know the names of the detectives for a long time. And for a long time, the detectives didn't really know who they were working for. And that way, like you say, if somebody became an informant, they wouldn't be able to say very much. They wouldn't be able to identify anybody. So it was like an intricately assembled chain of information that was constructed so that they couldn't get in trouble, so that nobody could implicate anybody else.
Oh, that's interesting. Obviously that was well thought out. I didn't even think that they could, do that, because you always think of the mob movies, everybody's got looking behind their back and, and things like that. But we do have to take a quick break. But when we come back, I want to hear about how their racket that they had going on between, in the mafia. How did everything fall apart? What caused it to fall apart? And what was justice served at the with this case and things like that. So we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. We have author Michael Cannell. He is author of Blood and the Badge, the Mafia, 2 Killer Cops and a Scandal That Shocked the Nation. And we'll have a link for that in today's description, along with his website and how to buy the book and so much more.
A new year is here, and with Valentine's Day just around the corner, it's the perfect time to look ahead. Whether you're thinking about love, a new career path, a move, or even an investment, wouldn't it be amazing to know what messages the universe, or the other side, have in store for you? That's where Love and Lotus Tarot with Winnie Schrader comes in. Winnie's intuitive readings can help you gain the clarity and guidance you need to carve out a new path. Life is hard enough. Why not let the cards light the way? Readings are available by phone or live video, so you can connect with Winnie wherever you are. And right now, we've got deals just for you. Returning clients save 10% on any reading now through March. New clients, you're in luck. Save 20% on any reading booked between now and March 1st. Don't wait. Visit paranormal60.com and click on the Love and Lotus tab to book your session today. Discover what the cards have to say and step into your best year yet with Love and Lotus Tarot with Winnie Schrader.
Okay, and we're back. I have author Michael Cannell, the author of Blood and the Badge, The Mafia, Two Killer Cops, and a Scandal That Shocked the Nation. And before the break, we wanted to find out, like I was alluding to, how did everything implode and fall apart with the scheme that these two cops, Caracappa and Eppolito, were doing, and what was the outcome? What justice was served at the end of this? So if you can kind of take us where everything just kind of started falling apart for them.
Yeah, I mean, something really improbable happened, and I'll try to explain it clearly. Eppolito and Caracappa, a big part of their job was to feed the police information. And one day they urgently contacted via their intermediary, they contacted their mafia patron, Gaspipe Casso, and they told him that he was about to be arrested. He was involved in a scheme to corrupt and control a city project to replace the windows in public housing. And so Casso found out he was about to be arrested. He drove off in a stolen Jeep, said goodbye to his wife and children, drove off, and he spent the next couple of years living with his high school girlfriend in New Jersey. And the FBI eventually tracked him down. Interestingly, when he began using a cell phone, so this is 1991, I think. So he started using an early model of cell phone, and that allowed the FBI to locate him.
Wow.
So he was arrested. He was put into a detention center in downtown Manhattan and tried to escape 3 times, and then he gave up. And then he agreed to become an informant. So the man who had spent a big part of his adult life hiring these detectives or paying these detectives to help him kill informants became the biggest informant of all. And now, I mean, part of what he told the FBI in his debriefings was that he had these 2 corrupt cops on his payroll. And so now it looked like Eppolito and Caracappa would be prosecuted. And the FBI and the investigators had the insider to testify against him. Until Gaspipe Casso started to badmouth other informants, most particularly Sammy the Bull Gravano, an underboss who had flipped and had been critical in the prosecution of a series of mobsters, most notably John Gotti. So now Gaspipe Casso was toxic. The prosecutors didn't want to put him on the witness stand because he was bad-mouthing the other witnesses. And they didn't want those prosecutions to be endangered. So what was the solution to this? The solution was to tear up Gaspipe Casso's plea agreement, to tear up his arrangement and send him to Supermax prison, which is where he went until he died of COVID 4 years ago. So who was the winner in this situation? The winner was Ippolito and Caracappa. They dodged a bullet because the man who was going to testify against them quietly went away to Supermax and nobody ever heard from him again. And
Oh,
so Ippolito and Caracappa retired with their full pensions, their police pensions. They moved to Las Vegas. They lived across the street from each other in a gated community in Las Vegas. Then Ippolito wrote a book, a memoir, and that was the beginning of the end for them, because now people who had seen them in action as dirty cops
uh-huh.
now see their photograph in the books and figure out who they were. For
Oh,
example, I told you about Jimmy Heidel, the young man they abducted. Well,
yeah.
his mother, Jimmy's mother, saw them come. They came to the house, the family
Uh-huh.
house. And so she saw Ippolito on the Sally Jesse Raphael talk show promoting his book. So then she knew who it was that had abducted her son.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Now I
So,
know where OJ got his tips on writing books.
yeah,
Like, oh my God, why would you do that?
he couldn't stop himself because he wanted attention. He just was the kind of person that wanted attention. And
Oh.
so Betty Heidel, Jimmy's mother, now knew who had abducted her son. She didn't
Mm-hmm.
trust the FBI, but she did trust a detective named Tommy Dades. And she called
Okay.
Tommy Dades. And Tommy Dades started the investigation all over again with the boxes of evidence that the feds had put on a shelf and forgotten about. And that's what eventually led to their prosecution, their conviction. But it gets more complicated than that, because once they were convicted, the judge threw the conviction out on a technicality. Now,
What?
the conviction was eventually reinstated by another court, and they
Okay.
eventually did go to, I'm giving away the ending here, but they did go to jail, but they went to jail after many episodes in which it looked like they would get away with this.
Yeah. I mean, justice was served, but a little too late. Like, it should have been taken care of, like, probably 20 years before they actually got
Yeah.
convicted. Because so they just went away. Now, they didn't try and do a tell-all book from jail or interviews and stuff, or has he been trying to do that? Was he trying to do that as well, or they just let him? You're not having contact at all with anybody anymore.
No, once they went away, they went away, and there was,
Okay.
there was that was that was that. And um, they appealed their case, but they didn't get anywhere with it. And of course, for the New York City Police Department, which has suffered through many well publicized episodes of police corruption, this was, if you ask the detectives who worked this case at the time, they will say
Mm-hmm.
this was surely the worst case of police corruption in New York history.
Okay. Now, when he wrote that book, and now he's in prison, after when that caused everything to fall apart. Now he's in jail. Did he have with his book? I mean, did he have a bounty on his head for telling any type of secrets in the book? I mean, were people, putting him on the chopping block at all?
I don't actually know what Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa's circumstances were once they went to federal prison, but I will say that generally what would happen in this circumstances is that they would be kept isolated for that reason, for their own
Okay.
protection, because certainly the mafia would not want them talking about things
Right.
in prison. So it's a standard mob practice to kill people in this position when if there's any suspicion about them in prison.
Right. I mean, you always see that, like, for instance, in The Sopranos, like, Christopher Moltisanti, his character, he kind of wanted to get into like movies and writing scripts and stuff, and his family was like, his mob family, was like, no, because they don't want all that, because that's going to play out in anything, whether it's a book, a movie, a TV show, and yeah, so I like how there's so many type of mafia movies and how they hit on different elements, because there's so many layers to the mafia. You have, dirty cops over here, you have underbosses and bosses and capos and all this stuff, and it's a lot of working wheels going all at once. Knowing that these cops really, how do I want to put this? I don't want to say screwed over, but I mean to cause that distrust in the public, knowing that cops, some like that, could easily be bought off, and especially if you're somebody who's like a witness to something, and you go to these cops, and it's like they're just going to give you up or something, and then next thing you know, you got a bullet in the back of your head. And I'm glad that justice was served, but yeah, it seemed like it took too long, but eventually it happened. Now, was there any type of like courtroom drama or anything like that during the trial, or was it pretty much a kind of, close the book, shut case, you're guilty, go to prison?
There was so much drama. There was so much.
Yes, I love court drama.
I mean, that's why it's fun. It's fun to write about these cases and hopefully fun to read about them, because the courtrooms, I mean, if you're writing a book like this, the courtroom is a wonderful literary device, because when the trial happens, things tend to get resolved. The truth tends to come out. There's a kind of climactic scenes where everybody comes together. I mean, excruciatingly awkward, because the families of their victims were sitting in the courtroom right next to Ippolito and Caracapa's families. So families of perpetrators sitting next to family of victims.
Yeah.
Now, this is a courtroom in downtown Brooklyn, New York, and there's really one place that people would go for lunch during the lunch breaks, and that was a diner across Cadman Plaza, kind of classic New York City coffee shop. And they would all go there, and they would sometimes the families of the victims would confront Ippolito and Caracappa while they were eating their, cheeseburgers in the coffee shop. So Louis Ippolito had a son by his first marriage, and he had 2 daughters and a son by his second marriage. The first son, Lou Jr., came there with his partner, and he was really estranged from the family. And he came there really to, as he explained to me, to try to figure out whether his father was guilty or not. He had a really open mind about it. And Louis Ippolito's second wife and her family, they were furious about that, because they only wanted people to be supportive of Louis. And one day, the first son, Lou Jr., was getting his car in the parking garage, and he had a confrontation with his stepmother and half sisters that sounds like it was a physical confrontation. So the air, my point is that the air was charged with this kind of tension throughout the trial.
Wow. Yeah, and that just having going to a cafe and just sitting down and sitting next to the people that caused you all this pain, and killing, their family members and being victims. What icky vibe. That I wouldn't want to be in that courtroom.
Awkward isn't a strong enough word. I mean, excruciating, I think is
toxic, very toxic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for joining me and giving me a little insight on this. This was, I love how, my favorite part of this is how he got caught. But it is sad that there are victims, but luckily, justice was served and they went to jail. But you are the author of Blood and the Badge, The Mafia, Two Killer Cops, and a Scandal That Shocked the Nation. Now, do you have a website or anything where people can go and check out your other books and maybe some upcoming events that you're at?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for asking, Winnie. It's michaelcannell.com. So that's Michael Cannell is Cannell, michaelcannell.com.
Great. And I'll have all those links in today's description guide, along with the buy the book link and all those other things. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and maybe I'll get you back on for your other book. I even, Brotherhood Betrayal. Yeah, you can't go wrong with that. I mean, I love a good mob story. It's my jam. I love it. Now, in today's interview, I mentioned the movie Donnie Brasco. Now, if you haven't seen Donnie Brasco, you need to. It stars Al Pacino and Johnny Depp. Now, the movie is centered around FBI agent Joseph Pistone, who has infiltrated one of the major New York crime families and is living under the name Donnie Brasco. But he did develop a relationship with the mob hitman Benji Lefty Ruggiero, who is played by Al Pacino. And in order to get in deep undercover, he ends up developing a real friendship with this mafioso. And as it develops, Pistone must decide whether or not to complete his job, knowing that it will lead to murder of his new friend. And the duality of it is pretty interesting. So if you haven't seen Donnie Brasco, I highly recommend it. You can probably find it on any streaming service. But yeah, and I'll even put a link for it in today's description so that way you have easy access to it. But I do have some programming notes as well. I am going to be out of town for the next couple of Sundays. So I will be uploading my show directly to YouTube and both mine and Dave's Paranormal 60 YouTube page and the Mysteries Mayhem and Merlot YouTube page because I cannot play my videos live. But I still will give you guys some great content while I am taking a much needed vacation. Thank you guys so much, and I hope to see you all next week. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. And until our next case, my armchair detectives, stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay aware. I'll see you right here next week on Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot.